Hi everyone, my name is Joseph Kulik and welcome to my talk, Avenues of Inclusion, Making Accessible Games Alongside People with Disabilities. I am a white man wearing a white t-shirt with black hair. And just to provide you with a little bit of an introduction to myself, my name is Joseph Kulik and I'm the Accessibility Program Manager at Splash Damage. I have a background where I was previously working as a games user researcher alongside an academic background in psychology, and I'm in the final stages of my PhD in accessibility as well. Alongside which, I also have lived experience of disability and neurodiversity, with some experience of scoliosis and chronic pain and associated symptoms with that. I also have worked in the games industry, both as a user researcher and as an accessibility professional on a variety of titles. This is just an overview of the three key areas that I'm going to be covering today, and those are consulting, user research, and community. I think it's also important to express that I acknowledge there are other areas to get people with disabilities involved in the process of making games, and the largest one perhaps is through direct employment and through enabling your workspace to recruit and support employees with disabilities as well. That isn't the focus of this particular talk. I'm talking about on the external side, but that's something I recognize as being important too. We'll kick things off by talking about consulting. Hire a consultant involves pulling in someone with particular expertise in a specific area, and in this case, we're talking about accessibility, and this can be narrow, so it could be on a very specific area of accessibility, such as motor, or it could be broad. It could be someone who's a broad domain expert around accessibility in games and all of the kind of best practices around that. Consultants can also provide feedback on any area of the game. So this means that extending beyond the design process into development, studio processes, and other areas. And this might be, as I mentioned, in a single category of disability, or it might be more broad. I mentioned that consultants often have lived experience of disability, but unlike accessibility playtesters, they also have knowledge beyond that lived experience. That knowledge can be on things like broad guidelines and best practices around accessibility, knowledge around the game development process, like understanding things that happen in game development and understanding that you're kind of working with constraints. And also, like, they are effective communicators, they are effective educators around accessibility as well. So that isn't necessarily the case with everyone with lived experience of disability, but with a consultant, you expect them to be effective in communicating around their needs and around the needs of people with disabilities to the developers so that they can educate on how to make games more accessible. These accessibility consultants hold specialized expertise that teams often don't possess internally, and even if they do, those people don't necessarily want to be relied upon as the accessibility expert on their team when they're, a professional programmer or gameplay designer or something else. They also are able to look past the development status, and this is something that's different between consultants and user researchers, is that consultants have the experience with the game development process to be able to look through the state of your game, the kind of design documentation, and understand the risks, anticipate issues, and guide your design. They can also influence the full process. So it's not just the endpoint, it's not just the product. It is your processes. It is, how you're testing around accessibility. It's around your studio accessibility as well. All manner of different things around how you're making games. And in terms of when you might want to involve a consultant, it's really at the earliest possible stages in a development process. They can guide your design and process before a build is playable. This could be designs, but it could even be early. It could be kind of establishing what the legal requirements are for a game with certain features and the types of games that you want to be making. It could be helping you understand your competitors in that space and the accessibility of those games. It could also be at later stages as well. It doesn't have to just be around the product and the design, although a lot of it might be. It could also be around communication, how you communicate with players with disabilities, and make sure you enable people to understand how accessible or inaccessible your game is as well. And in terms of how, you can either work with individual consultants, and there are lots of great consultants that we worked with at Splash Damage, such as Sightless Combat, Harriet Frayling, and Matthew Alcock. There's also many cats have a list of accessibility experts. So these are expert consultants that you could pull in and recruit to help you around these particular areas. And then, as well as that, there are various agencies that you could use. So Player Research, Easy Surf, Many Cats, and Playability all have networks of accessibility consultants that are available for people to work with. Moving on to user research. User research is about de-risking development with insight from representative player audiences and benefits from having players feature in it who are more distant from the game development process. So that is what differentiates it from consultancy in particular, is that these participants who feature in user research studies are supposed to be representative or at least more representative players. So that means in this case, you're looking at players and their natural experience of playing the game. And with that, you're also acknowledging your design as a hypothesis on how people will experience it. So this means, when you're constructing, say, a feature around, reducing the motor demand around moving through the world, that is a hypothesis on how people with motor disabilities might be able to remove barriers in play. They might be able to experience the game without those barriers. What you need to do is test that with representative player audiences in order to determine whether that is successful or unsuccessful. And that's the type of area where accessibility focused user research comes in. Often we're also talking about larger sample sizes than with consultancy as well. With consultancies, often N of one. User research will often be a larger sample size, which tells us more about how people broadly experience the game. So related to this, there are really two strands of research focus. One is this idea of accessibility focused research, and this might be traditionally usability focused research in the games industry. And this is focused on kind of what players can understand, what they can do, but from an accessibility perspective. So if we go back to that idea of a kind of a movement accessibility feature, we're looking at whether players with a motor disability are able to engage with this feature, are they able to get through without it creating a barrier, are they able to understand how to use it, and things like that. But then the other strand is inclusive research, and that is within all of your research around the development process. So you might have things like larger lab, like larger scale aspects focus on the experience and appreciation of the game. You're also including people with disabilities in that process as well. So you're getting that insight on whether they enjoy the narrative, whether they enjoy the gameplay and things like that. When they're playing with these accessibility features, do they actually enjoy the game? Because it could be the case that they don't. They experience them differently. So it's important also to include people with a range of ability in the full process of user research, in my opinion, as well. In terms of reasoning for why you want to conduct user research, the first thing to remember is that you are not your users and you do not have the same ability to experience the game as them. As developers, you are too close and suffer from something called expertise oversight. And that is where your closeness to the product, to the game, leads you to have a different mental model about how it works. And you have different expectations at that stage. If you want to find the accessibility setting, for instance, you know where to go. You inherently know how the menus are structured. And this isn't how players will naturally play your game. And you could argue that, well, we can pull developers from other projects who aren't as familiar, but they still have these mental models that are associated with being developers. They have these expectations of how things should work and how game development works that are not natural to your player audience. And this is especially true when we're talking about people with disabilities who have their unique lived experiences involved as well. The other factor is that people with disabilities are actually already playing your games, and you're improving the experience for the people who are already there, making it more accessible, reducing friction, as well as making a game that is better designed for everyone. If you think about accessibility features, very often there is overlap between different needs of other communities, such as, for instance, competitive players. Competitive players appreciate a level of granularity, they appreciate button remapping, they can appreciate sensitivity sliders. Accessibility wants all those things as well. So in terms of when user research should occur, usually it's best from first playable. Like prototypes are actually a great way to start. It doesn't have to be when you have a kind of playable full build of your game. It can be that you have a prototype on a particular feature. Maybe you have that movement system. Maybe you have the mechanics in which you mantle and walk around the world and experience various navigation aspects of the game. Maybe that's something you can test. Maybe you can test that with a prototype. Maybe you can run an accessibility play test and establish the needs of that audience and establish kind of what you might be able to do to reduce the demand to meet those needs and make sure they're not experiencing disability when they try and play that aspect of the game. Sooner is better in order to do this, and it is also an iterative process. This is something that should be a back and forth between users and designers to improve the experience, to get to a point that the player base is able to work with. In terms of how user research can either be in-house, which comes with early challenges, but can be long-term cost effective and easier to integrate with your teams and get buy-in around your user research. However, it can also be through vendors, which is especially useful when you're building UXR experience and maturity, as well as for smaller teams where internal UXR does not make sense due to the size of the studio, or maybe your lab doesn't have capacity. Maybe you have a user research team and you actually don't have capacity to run all the testing that you need at the time, and that's when you might want to lean on vendors as well. And there are lots of good vendors around user research and accessibility too. I also want to stress that with accessibility research, it's imperative that the testing itself is accessible. And this comes down to three high level principles. The first, inclusive design, so reducing the demand for everyone, making it as accessible as possible for everyone. The second, accommodation, where that's not possible, you make accommodations and you make those available to as many people as possible. And then the third is transparency, where you're as clear as possible on the demands of the space, on what accommodations you can provide, on how you design it to be inclusive as well, so that people can understand before they arrive if they're able to participate. And finally, touching on community. And community is one of the main areas where your company effectively interfaces with people with disabilities. And this can be through your expos, through pre-release events, through social communication. This could be on Reddit, this could be a third-party platform, it could be an internal platform, it could be through customer services and things like that as well. And it's important to acknowledge that this is a touch point for people with disabilities too. And therefore, we need to make all of this accessible as well. And the reason to do this really is that games are our product, but the player experience extends beyond our games into communities and into interaction with streamers at events and even communication they just have with friends. All of these aspects are facets of our game that are affected, like have a bi-directional relationship with the player experience. So someone, for instance, might communicate something on Reddit, and that experience then affects how they play the game, and then they go back to Reddit and talk about it with people. And that's actually the experience of playing many modern games. So it's important if we want to pull people into the experience of play that we're also able to extend accessibility into those spaces as well. This is key to including people with disabilities in the full experience of playing our games. So in terms of communication, we're talking about three major areas. The first is letting players know about the accessibility features in your game so they can know the game is being built for them as well. And the second is to make sure that this communication is accessible. So when you're communicating about your game and these accessibility features, this communication is accessible. However, this should also extend into all of the other promotion around your game. However possible, you should be making it as accessible as possible. So that means things like trailers, promotional material that isn't around accessibility. You should be adhering to web accessibility standards, making those trailers as accessible as possible with things like descriptive audio and things like that to ensure that people with disabilities are able to know if the game's been built for them and are able to get caught up in the hype of your game in the same way that everyone else in the community is too. In terms of events, we're talking about making sure that the event itself is accessible. That includes physical materials, communication, the premises. Also, if there's online access, making sure those online facilities are also accessible. And also, as well as this, it's about involving the disability community. So that means inviting people in the disability community to participate in your events and letting them know that you've made these decisions to make the event accessible so they know if they're able to participate as well. And then finally, we also have community. And the idea of this is that in order for the overall experience of engaging with the game to be accessible, we also need the community to be accessible as well. And this means things like adherence to accessibility guidelines on things like web and applications where people engage with the community guidelines for things like alt text so that other people in the community are making the space accessible for other users. And also community management that encourage inclusive and safe social spaces, because I know various people with disabilities experience a lot of abuse in these communities too, especially if they have a visible disability in these spaces. So we've been through the four different avenues here, but where do you get started as a studio? Just kind of echoing some of the concerns that developers might have at this stage. One of the big ones might be, where do I start? These are three different areas, and it's not really clear what to get started with first. And it also seems like a lot to do if it's not something you've been started on already. The other factor is that, with all of this, these three different areas and the fact that it looks like there's a lot going on in each one, it looks like it should be someone's job. It looks like a substantial amount of work, enough to constitute more than someone's job in most cases. And just around these concerns, I want to stress that ultimately accessibility isn't about achieving perfection. It's about improving. It's about improvement over time, and that starts with taking that first step and building momentum. And with that, you'll find accessibility becomes cheaper over time. That the more you invest into it, the easier it becomes to make things accessible. The easier it becomes to make your games accessible because you house more knowledge and you start engaging with the process earlier in your development. The other thing I would stress is that accessibility is everyone's responsibility at a studio. However, if spearheading these initiatives sounds like it should be someone's job, then it might be the case that it should be. Plenty of developers are hiring accessibility leads, such as myself, accessibility program managers, to help spearhead processes like the ones described in this talk forward to help the studio make increasingly accessible games that can reach a wider audience of players. I've been Joseph Kulik, and thank you very much for listening to my talk. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn.